The moment my parents screamed that I either paid for my sister's wedding or vanished from their lives forever, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just looked around the dining table in the house I paid for and realized something irreversible had already begun. Before I tell you how a single dinner ended an entire family illusion, do me a small favor. Support this story by subscribing and telling me in the comments where you're listening from. Stories like this survive because people recognize themselves in them. I'm Evelyn Cross, and I was 31 years old when my family finally said the quiet part out loud. They delivered the ultimatum at my table. My oak table. The one I bought after my third promotion when I finally stopped renting and signed a mortgage with my own signature. My own credit, my own fear. The chandelier above us. 6 months of savings. The hardwood floors beneath their shoes. Installed by contractors, I paid myself. And there they were, sitting comfortably, eating the food I bought, telling me what I owed them next. Family supports family, my father said, cutting into his roast as if he were discussing the weather. Your sister's wedding is your responsibility. My mother nodded, already rehearsed. If you refuse, then don't call us your family anymore. Across from me, my younger sister Clara smiled. Not wide, not smug, just that practiced, serene smile she'd perfected since childhood. The one that said she'd already won before the game even started. I didn't answer immediately. I felt something settle instead. Not anger, not shock, clarity, because this wasn't really about a wedding. It never had been. 3 years earlier, my parents arrived at my doorstep with 2 suitcases and a story about bad luck. My father had lost his accounting job in Hawthorne City, a place that prided itself on prestige and quietly discarded anyone over 50. They needed somewhere temporary, they said, just until he found something new. Temporary lasted exactly 36 months. Within a week, my living room was rearranged. My kitchen reorganized. My office claimed for job searching, which apparently involved golf videos and business podcasts played loudly at noon. My mother critiqued my groceries, my thermostat, my schedule. Clara followed a month later after needing space from a breakup that somehow lasted 3 years. I was already used to being adaptable. I'd been working since 16. Scholarships through college. 3 jobs during law school. Student debt that felt like a second spine. I built my career brick by brick at a mid-sized firm in Northbridge, where being competent meant being invisible until you were indispensable. I thought stability meant safety. I was wrong. The first thing I lost was my bedroom. Clara needs the bigger room, my mother said, already moving my things. She's sensitive. I slept in my guest room. A twin bed. Thin walls. I told myself it was temporary too. Then came the bills. Electricity tripled because my father liked the house cold. Groceries doubled because my mother discovered quality ingredients. My car became communal. My weekends disappeared into errands no one thanked me for. And every time I tried to talk about money, about boundaries, about fairness, I got the same look. That look that said I was being difficult again. Clara never worked longer than 6 months anywhere. She was finding herself. I funded the space. She used to do it. My parents insisted I was lucky, single, successful, no children to drain my finances. You don't need much, Clara once said casually. At least your money's doing something meaningful. Meaningful. That word followed me like a bruise. I noticed the lies before the ultimatum came. Small ones at first. Neighbors thanking my parents for supporting me during a hard time. Friends asking if everything was okay financially. My parents had been telling people they'd moved in to help me. Help me. I started therapy 6 months before the dinner. My therapist didn't call it stress. She called it financial and emotional enmeshment. She asked a question that lodged itself in my chest. What happens if you say no? I didn't know. I found out at dinner. They'd already priced the wedding. $28,000. Venue. Flowers. Photographer. A vineyard outside Silver Ridge. Because Clara deserved something special. I asked calmly why her fiancé's family wasn't contributing. Silence. Then my father leaned back and said, "Because you can afford it." That was when my mother added the line that ended everything. "If you don't do this," she said softly, "then you shouldn't be part of this family anymore." They thought it was leverage. They didn't realize it was permission. I stood up slowly, not dramatically, not angrily, like I was preparing to speak in court. "I will not pay for this wedding," I said, "and you have 24 hours to leave my house." The air vanished. Clara's smile disappeared. My mother gasped. My father stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "You don't mean that," my mother said. "I do," I replied. "This is my home, my income, my life, and I am done financing people who treat me like an obligation." They called me selfish, cold, ungrateful. I didn't argue. That night, I slept in my own room for the first time in 3 years. And that was only the beginning. The morning after I told them they had 24 hours to leave, the house felt unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite explain. Not empty, not peaceful yet, just alert, like the walls themselves were waiting to see who would blink first. My parents didn't pack. They sat at the kitchen table like nothing had happened, sipping coffee from mugs I bought, speaking in low, urgent whispers as if I weren't walking past them to make breakfast. Clara stayed in her room, door closed, probably texting relatives, rehearsing the version of events where she was the wounded party and I was the villain. I went to work anyway. I refused to call in sick, refused to hide. If I was going to dismantle a lifetime of conditioning, I wasn't going to do it by shrinking. By noon, my phone started vibrating. My aunt, my cousin, my father's brother, whom I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't answer. By mid-afternoon, the messages started stacking. "How could you do this to your parents? They sacrificed everything for you. You're really throwing them out over a wedding." The story was already being rewritten without me. When I got home that evening, the house looked exactly the same and completely different. Suitcases sat half-packed in the hallway. Not fully, just enough to show effort without commitment. My mother was crying on the couch, loudly enough to be heard from the driveway. My father stood by the window, arms crossed, rehearsing anger. Clara sat at the table, phone face down, eyes red but dry. "So this is really happening," my father said. "Yes," I replied calmly. "You have until tonight." My mother stood abruptly. "You're destroying this family." "No," I said. "I'm refusing to keep being destroyed by it." Clara finally spoke. "You always do this. You make everything about money." I laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised even me. "No," I said. "You make everything about entitlement." Her face hardened. "You don't know what it's like to feel supported." Something inside me snapped, not explosively but cleanly like a cord being cut. "I supported you for years," I said. "You just didn't call it that because it didn't come with applause." My father stepped forward. "If you force us out, don't expect us to forgive you." I met his gaze. If forgiveness only exists when I comply, it isn't forgiveness. That night, they didn't leave. At exactly 11:30, I changed the locks. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. They banged on the door for 20 minutes. My mother cried. My father shouted. Clara screamed that I was heartless. I didn't open it. The next morning, my parents moved into a small furnished apartment across town. Clara stayed with a friend, and then the real fallout began. Within days, the rumors spread faster than I expected. At work, a colleague gently asked if everything was okay at home. At the grocery store, an older neighbor avoided eye contact. My grandmother called, confused and hurt, asking why I'd abandoned my parents. I drove to see her that afternoon. She listened quietly as I told her everything. The finances, the ultimatums, the wedding demand, the years of silent expectation. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded slowly, eyes sharp despite her age. When I finished, she sighed. I wondered how long it would take, she said. For what? I asked. For you to stop paying for everyone else's comfort. Her words steadied me more than she probably realized. Meanwhile, Clara escalated. She sent emails. Long ones. Emotional ones. Ones that swung wildly between apology and accusation. You're ruining my life. You're jealous. You always hated me. I never asked you to do all this. That last line almost made me reply. Almost. Instead, I forwarded everything to a folder I titled documentation. My therapist had told me to do that. Not for legal reasons, yet, but for clarity. Gaslighting thrives on erasure. Records don't. A week later, my mother showed up at my office. Security called me down. She looked smaller again, but sharper. Controlled. We need to talk, she said. In writing, I replied. Or with a mediator. Her face twisted. You've turned into someone I don't recognize. No, I said. I stopped pretending to be someone you preferred. She leaned in. Do you know what people are saying about you? Yes, I said calmly. And I know what they aren't saying. She left without another word. That night, something unexpected happened. I opened my banking app. And for the first time in years, my balance hadn't dropped unexpectedly. No extra grocery charges. No mysterious cash withdrawals. No utility spikes. The silence was financial and it was loud. 2 weeks later, Clara's fiancé, Evan Hale, called me. I didn't know who else to talk to, he said. I met him at a cafe halfway between our offices. He looked exhausted. She told me you refused to help because you're bitter, he said. But things aren't adding up. I didn't defend myself. I slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. 3 years of expenses. Rent. Utilities. Groceries. Insurance. Travel. All paid by me. He stared at it for a long time. She said your parents were helping you, he whispered. I shook my head. They said that too. His hands trembled slightly. She asked me to take out a loan, he admitted. For the wedding. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a family implosion. It was a pattern. I didn't tell him what to do. I just told him the truth. He left quietly. 2 days later, the engagement was postponed. Clara called me screaming. You poisoned him against me. No, I replied. You exposed yourself. She hung up. That night, I sat alone in my living room. Lights low, house quiet. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't bracing for the next demand. And yet the storm wasn't over. Because families that lose control don't let go easily. They escalate. By the time Evan postponed the wedding, the story had already escaped the walls of my house. It was no longer just my parents whispering to relatives or my sister crying to friends. It had become a shared narrative, one that traveled faster than truth ever does. In their version, I was cold, calculating, obsessed with money, willing to humiliate my own family for the sake of control. In my version, I was simply done being used. But versions don't compete equally. The loudest one wins first. At work, people stopped asking questions and started offering sympathy in that careful, sideways way that told me they'd already heard something. A colleague left a note on my desk saying she hoped things worked out with my parents. Another mentioned, too casually, that family conflicts could be messy when money is involved. I smiled, nodded, and said nothing. I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided which version was easier to swallow. What surprised me most wasn't the judgment. It was the silence from my parents. After the apartment move, they stopped calling altogether. No angry voicemails. No late-night guilt trips. Just nothing. That silence was heavier than the shouting ever had been. It meant they were planning. Clara, on the other hand, did not stop. She showed up at my door one afternoon without warning. I didn't open it. I watched through the side window as she paced, wiped her eyes, rehearsed expressions in the reflection of her phone. When she finally left, she slid an envelope under the door. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dramatic, apologetic in tone, but sharp in subtext. She wrote about how lonely she felt, about how abandoned she was, about how she never meant for things to go this far. She reminded me of childhood memories where I'd protected her, defended her, covered for her. She ended with a single line that made my stomach turn. "I just need you one more time." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I added it to the documentation folder. That evening, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was from my father. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the ultimatum he'd issued at my table. Instead, he attached a document. It was a spreadsheet. My name at the top, numbers below, categories labeled family support, shared living, parental investment. At the bottom, a bolded total. He was claiming I owed them. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting to feel angry. I didn't. I felt something colder, clearer. I forwarded the email to my attorney. Not because I was scared, but because I was finished pretending this was still a family disagreement. It wasn't. It was an attempted rewrite of reality, and now it had crossed into something that required witnesses. 2 days later, my attorney confirmed what I already knew. The document meant nothing legally. No agreements. No leases. No shared ownership. No debt. But the intent behind it mattered. It told me exactly how far they were willing to go. The next escalation came through my grandmother. She called me late one night, her voice tight with worry. "Your parents say you've cut them off completely," she said. "They say they're struggling, that they're embarrassed." I closed my eyes and counted my breaths before responding. "I didn't cut them off," I said carefully. "I stopped funding them." There was a pause. Then she sighed. "That's what I thought." She told me my mother had been calling relatives daily, crying about how she never imagined her own daughter would choose money over blood. She told me my father had framed it as a moral failure on my part, a betrayal of values, a cautionary tale. I asked my grandmother one question. Did they mention the ultimatum? She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said softly. "They didn't." That was when I realized something important. They weren't just reacting. They were controlling the narrative with intention. A week later, Clara posted a photo online. It was an old one, from years ago. The two of us smiling at a family event, arms around each other. The caption read, "Some people forget where they came from." The comments were worse. I didn't respond. I didn't explain. I didn't correct anyone. Instead, I kept living my life. I focused on my work. I slept better than I had in years. I cooked meals for one, without apology. I started going on evening walks, just to feel the quiet. The absence of constant tension felt unnatural at first, like silence after fire alarm stops ringing. And that's when Evan called again. This time his voice was different, steadier. "I ended it," he said. "I didn't ask questions. I let him talk. He told me about the loan request, about the contradictions, about how Clara had reacted when he asked to see her finances, about how she accused him of betrayal for questioning her at all. I realized I wasn't marrying a partner," he said quietly. "I was marrying a crisis." When we hung up, I sat on my couch and stared at the wall for a long time. Not in relief, not in satisfaction, in understanding. Because what was happening wasn't about a wedding anymore. It was about exposure. Clara's safety net was collapsing. My parents' authority was cracking. And the version of me they'd relied on, the one who fixed everything quietly, was gone. They had underestimated something critical. I wasn't just walking away. I was standing still. And that's when people started losing their footing. The silence didn't last. It never does when control slips away from people who've lived off it for years. The first crack came through a certified letter. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately. Tight, precise, the kind that always looked authoritative even when the content beneath it was hollow. Inside was a demand, not a request. A demand. He claimed that during the 3 years they lived with me, they had contributed emotionally, logistically, and socially to the household, and that my decision to remove them without notice constituted financial harm. He suggested mediation. He suggested arbitration. He suggested, thinly veiled beneath polite phrasing, that legal action was an option. I didn't even finish reading before I started laughing. Not hysterical laughter. Not bitterness. The kind that comes when you finally see how desperate someone has become. I handed the letter to my attorney the next morning. She read it once, raised an eyebrow, and slid it back toward me. "They have nothing," she said simply, "but they want to scare you." That word stuck with me. Scare. Because for most of my life that had worked. Fear of being labeled selfish. Fear of being the bad daughter. Fear of being cut off emotionally. They had used fear like a leash. It just wasn't attached anymore. The next escalation was public. My mother posted a long message online, not naming me directly but not hiding either. She wrote about sacrifices, about raising children who forget their roots, about how success can change people. Friends commented with sympathy. Distant relatives chimed in with vague judgments. People I barely remembered from childhood weighed in like experts. I read every word once. Then I closed the app, because something inside me had shifted permanently. Their words no longer defined my reality. They only revealed theirs. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had kept records. Not out of spite, out of survival. I had bank statements, utility bills, mortgage payments, insurance renewals, grocery receipts, car maintenance records, medical expenses I'd quietly covered, every temporary cost that became permanent without discussion. 3 years of proof. I didn't post it. I didn't threaten to share it. I just kept it, because power doesn't need to announce itself. A few days later, my grandmother called again. This time she didn't sound worried. She sounded tired. "They came to see me," she said. "They wanted me to talk to you." I already knew what she was going to say, but I let her continue. "They told me you've changed, that you're cold now, that money made you hard." "And what did you say?" I asked. She paused. I asked them why their adult daughter was the only one expected to sacrifice. That was the moment something loosened in my chest. "They didn't have an answer," she continued, "so I told them to stop." I swallowed hard. "They won't listen to me," she said gently, "but they're starting to hear." That mattered more than I expected, because families like mine don't crumble all at once. They fracture slowly, quietly, through moments where old authority stops being absolute. The next moment came from an unexpected place. My father's former employer reached out. Not to me directly, to my firm. He requested a consultation. I didn't take it. I let a colleague handle the intake. But later that day, she came to my office confused. "He mentioned you," she said. "Said you were family." I nodded. "He wanted advice about a dispute with his daughter," she continued. "About finances, boundaries, living arrangements." I felt a strange calm settle over me. "Did you tell him?" I asked. She hesitated. "That conflicts would apply?" "Yes," she said. "And he didn't like it." I almost smiled, because suddenly the story was repeating itself. But this time, I wasn't the only one refusing to play my assigned role. Clara tried again a week later. This time she didn't accuse. She didn't plead. She apologized. At least she tried to. She asked to meet. Neutral place. Public. She said she just wanted closure. I agreed. She arrived late. Eyes puffy, makeup hastily applied. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not fragile. Just stripped of entitlement. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under," she said quietly. I waited. "I didn't know how bad it was," she continued. I still waited. I thought you were fine. You never complained." There it was. The final truth. They hadn't mistaken my silence for strength. They had mistaken it for consent. "I didn't complain," I said calmly, because complaining never changed anything. She looked down at her hands. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Everything feels unstable now." I nodded. "That's what happens when you stand on someone else's foundation." She flinched but didn't argue. For the first time, she didn't ask me to fix it. She just sat there. When we parted, nothing was resolved. But something was different. She knew I wasn't coming back to save her. And that knowledge changed the dynamic forever. The final blow came quietly. My parents stopped posting, stopped calling relatives, stopped demanding. They didn't apologize. They didn't admit fault. But they stopped. That silence was not peace, but it was surrender. And I realized something crucial. They didn't need me anymore. Not because they'd grown stronger, but because the system that relied on my compliance had collapsed. I was no longer the pressure valve. I was no longer the safety net. I was no longer the solution. And in losing me, they were forced to face themselves. That night, I sat alone in my living room, the house finally mine in every sense. No tension humming in the walls. No expectation waiting in the next room. Just quiet and clarity. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had removed myself from a structure that depended on my exhaustion to function. And that realization was irreversible. The strangest thing about peace is how unfamiliar it feels at first. For weeks after everything went quiet, I kept waiting for the next disruption. A phone call, a knock at the door, another ultimatum dressed up as concern. My body stayed alert even when my mind knew better. Years of living in reaction don't disappear overnight. But nothing came. Instead, mornings arrived without tension. I drank my coffee slowly, no longer bracing for complaints about the brand or the temperature or the way I held the mug. I left the house without guilt trailing behind me like a shadow. I came home without rehearsing conversations in my head. The silence wasn't empty. It was spacious. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I started noticing myself. Not the version of me that functioned as a provider, a mediator, a financial buffer, a problem solver. The version that had preferences, curiosity, opinions that didn't need approval. I realized how many decisions I'd been making for other people without realizing it. What food to buy, what shows to watch, what days were too busy to rest because someone else might need something. I stopped doing that. I bought furniture I liked instead of furniture that could survive careless use. I rearranged rooms without considering whether anyone else would approve. I painted a wall a color my mother would have called impractical. It felt rebellious, almost dangerous, which told me everything I needed to know about the environment I'd escaped. At work, the change was just as noticeable. Without the constant drain of family emergencies, my focus sharpened. I stopped volunteering for extra work out of guilt and started choosing projects strategically. People noticed. Promotions followed. Opportunities opened. Not because I worked harder, but because I was no longer working exhausted. One afternoon, my therapist said something that stayed with me. "You weren't selfish," she said. "You were over-functioning in a system that depended on your self-erasure." That sentence unlocked memories I hadn't named before. Times I'd canceled plans because my sister needed me. Times I'd delayed personal goals because my parents weren't ready. Times I'd swallowed resentment because being agreeable felt safer than being honest. I wasn't weak. I was trained. And once training is recognized, it can be undone. The first real test of that came months later. My father called. Just once. No warning. No build-up. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded older. Not frail. Just stripped of authority. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm listening," I replied. There was a pause. Then a sigh. "Things have been difficult." I didn't interrupt. We're managing, he added quickly, as if correcting himself. But it's been an adjustment. Another pause. I wanted to ask, he continued, if you'd consider helping a little, just temporarily. There it was. Not an apology, not accountability, a softened version of the same expectation. No, I said calmly. The word landed like a closed door. He cleared his throat. I'm not asking for much. I'm not offering anything, I replied. Silence stretched between us. You've changed, he said finally. Yes, I agreed. I have. He waited for more. For justification. For guilt. It didn't come. When he hung up, I felt something settle deep in my chest. Finality. Not cruel. Not angry. Final. The world didn't end. No lightning struck. I made dinner. I watched a show. I slept peacefully. And I understood something essential. Boundaries don't need to be dramatic to be effective. They just need to be consistent. My sister tried once more after that. This time, she didn't ask for money. She asked for forgiveness. I feel like I lost you, she said quietly over coffee. I studied her face. She looked tired. Wiser, maybe. Or just worn down by reality. You didn't lose me, I said. You lost access. She winced. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. I know, I replied. But intention doesn't erase impact. She nodded slowly. I don't know how to be close to you without needing you, she admitted. That honesty mattered. We can learn, I said. But it won't look like before. She didn't argue. That was new. We didn't reconcile completely. Not then. Maybe not ever in the way she imagined. But for the first time, our relationship wasn't built on extraction. It was tentative, uneven, real. And that was enough. As months passed, I stopped being the villain in my own mind. I stopped replaying arguments. Stopped defending my choices internally. I didn't need their understanding anymore. I had my own. I started traveling alone. Just short trips at first. Then longer ones. Places where no one knew my family role. Where I was just a woman choosing where to sit, what to eat, how long to stay. It was liberating in ways I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lived my life. One night, sitting in a quiet hotel room overlooking a city I'd never been to before, hit me. I wasn't running away. I was arriving. Arriving in a life where love didn't require self-sacrifice. Where family wasn't synonymous with obligation. Where peace wasn't something I earned by suffering. I thought about the ultimatum that had started everything. Pay or disappear. And I smiled. Because in refusing to pay, I hadn't disappeared. I had finally become visible to myself. The version of me that existed now wasn't hardened. She was grounded. She didn't flinch at raised voices. She didn't rush to fix discomfort. She didn't confuse guilt with love. She chose. And that choice changed everything. By the time a full year passed, my life no longer resembled the one I had escaped. Not because it was flashy. Not because everything was perfect. But because it was mine. I woke up without dread. I made plans without checking who they might inconvenience. I spent money without mentally preparing a justification. The most startling change wasn't external. It was internal silence. The kind that comes when your nervous system finally understands it's safe. For years, my body had lived in anticipation of needs, disappointment, demands. Even when nothing was happening, I was braced, ready, waiting to be summoned. That tension faded slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one morning I realized something strange. I hadn't thought about them in days. Not my parents, not my sister, not the role I used to play. They no longer occupied the center of my mental landscape. That's when I understood. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It simply replaces what once consumed you. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. The clarity brought grief, too. Grief for the family I thought I had, for the version of myself that believed endurance was the same as love. Some nights I mourned quietly, not for them, but for the years I had given without question. And then, one afternoon, the past reached for me again. It came in the form of a letter, handwritten, my mother's handwriting. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The old reflex returned for a split second. The instinct to prepare, to manage, to soften what might come next. I let that instinct pass. Inside, the letter was careful, measured, polite in a way that felt unfamiliar. She wrote about time, about reflection, about how things hadn't gone the way we expected. She wrote that my father was working more hours now, that they were adjusting, that it was harder than they imagined. Then came the line I recognized immediately. We didn't realize how much pressure you were under. Not an apology, an observation. The letter ended with an invitation. Dinner. Neutral territory. Just to talk. I folded the paper slowly. A year ago, I would have gone immediately, heart pounding, mind racing, hoping this time things would be different. Now, I waited 3 days before responding. And when I did, my reply was simple. I'm open to a conversation, with clear boundaries. Nothing more. The dinner happened 2 weeks later. I arrived early, chose my seat, ordered for myself. When they walked in, I saw them differently, not as authorities, not as burdens, but as adults navigating consequences. My mother looked smaller, my father quieter. We exchanged greetings. No hugs. That alone said everything. The conversation was cautious, surface level at first. Weather, work, neutral facts. Then my father spoke. We didn't think you'd actually do it, he said. I met his gaze. That was the problem. Silence followed. My mother reached for her water glass, then stopped. We thought family meant sacrifice, she said. We thought you understood that. I did, I replied. Too well. She flinched. You never asked us to stop, she said softly. I shouldn't have had to, I answered. Love doesn't require instructions for basic respect. That was the moment something shifted. Not reconciliation. Not forgiveness. Recognition. They weren't there to regain control. They were there because the absence of it had forced them to adapt. My father cleared his throat. We relied on you, he said. Too much. Yes, I agreed. We didn't mean to hurt you. I know, I said again. But impact matters more than intent. No one argued. That was new. We talked for another hour. No raised voices. No guilt. No ultimatums. When we stood to leave, my mother hesitated. I hope, she said carefully, that one day we can be closer again. I considered my answer. Maybe, I said, if closeness doesn't require my self-erasure. She nodded, and for the first time I believed she understood. Not fully, but enough. I walked away without feeling drained. That mattered. My sister didn't attend that dinner. She reached out later. Motherhood had changed her, not magically, not completely, but unmistakably. Responsibility has a way of doing that. She spoke less about what she wanted and more about what she was learning. I didn't know how much you carried, she admitted once, until no one carried it for me. That sentence stayed with me, because it confirmed something essential. I hadn't abandoned them. I had stopped absorbing consequences meant for others. The difference mattered. As time passed, my relationships became cleaner, simpler. People learned quickly that my yes meant yes, and my no didn't come with negotiation. Some drifted away. Others stepped closer. I learned to trust that process. One evening, sitting alone in my living room, I caught my reflection in the window. Calm, unburdened. I thought about the ultimatum again. Pay or disappear. And I understood the irony fully now. The moment I refused to disappear financially, I appeared emotionally. To myself. To my life. To my future. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I didn't need them to regret anything. I needed alignment. And I had it. The version of me that exists now doesn't measure worth by usefulness. She measures it by peace. What surprised me most wasn't how much my life improved after I set boundaries. It was how ordinary that improvement felt once I stopped living in survival mode. There was no dramatic victory lap. No single moment where the universe applauded my choices. Just a quiet accumulation of right decisions stacking on top of each other until one day I realized I was standing on solid ground. For years, I had mistaken exhaustion for purpose. I thought being needed meant being loved. I thought sacrifice was proof of character. I thought endurance was strength. But endurance without reciprocity is just slow erosion. The woman I am now doesn't rush to prove her worth. She doesn't explain herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. She doesn't negotiate her boundaries to preserve appearances. She lives. And living, I learned, is not loud. It's waking up without resentment. It's making plans without guilt. It's choosing rest without apology. I stopped measuring success by how many people depended on me and started measuring it by how little I needed to recover at the end of the day. That changed everything. My home became a reflection of that shift. Every room held intention instead of obligation. Nothing existed for just in case someone else needs it. Everything existed because I wanted it there. I realized how radical that was for someone raised to believe her role was to accommodate. At work, my confidence stopped coming from overperformance and started coming from clarity. I didn't need to say yes to everything. I didn't need to outwork everyone to earn respect. My value was no longer tied to depletion, and people noticed, not because I was louder, but because I was steadier. The strangest thing happened as I grew calmer. Other people grew uncomfortable. People who were used to me bending found my stillness unsettling. They tested it, pushed at it, waited for the old version of me to reappear. She didn't. That's when I understood something critical. Growth doesn't offend people. Boundaries do. Because boundaries force others to face what they were taking without asking. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was just no longer compensating for their choices. There's a grief that comes with that realization. You mourn the fantasy that love would one day be returned in equal measure. You grieve the hope that if you just gave a little more, things would balance out. They don't. They never did. Letting go of that hope was painful, but it was also freeing. My parents learned to live within their means. My sister learned to navigate adulthood without a safety net disguised as love. Some extended family members stopped calling altogether once they realized there was nothing to gain. And the people who remained, they showed up without demands. That's how I learned the difference between connection and dependency. One afternoon, sitting on my porch as the sun dipped low, I thought about the version of myself who had sat at that dinner table months ago, listening to an ultimatum that tried to corner her into obedience. Pay or disappear. Back then, the threat felt enormous. Now it felt hollow. Because disappearing from systems that consume you isn't loss. It's escape. I didn't disappear from my family's life. I disappeared from a role that was killing me slowly. And in doing so, I finally showed up fully for myself. That's the part people don't tell you about choosing yourself. It doesn't make you lonely. It makes you honest. Honest about what you can give. Honest about what you will no longer tolerate. Honest about the life you actually want to live. There's still days when I miss what I thought family was supposed to be. I allow myself that sadness without letting it dictate my choices. Missing something doesn't mean returning to it. And loving someone doesn't mean funding their dysfunction. The peace I have now isn't fragile. It's built. Built from boundaries. Built from courage. Built from the quiet strength of saying no and meaning it. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the one who always pays, fixes, smooths things over, carries everyone else's weight, hear this clearly. You are not selfish for wanting a life that doesn't hurt. You are not cruel for refusing to be exploited. And you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint the people who benefited most from your silence. I'm Laura Ashworth. And the day I refused to buy my sister's wedding was the day I finally reclaimed my life. If this story resonated with you, do me a small favor. Subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach people who are standing exactly where I once stood, wondering if choosing themselves is allowed. Thank you for listening.